Tashi Delay, everyone, and welcome back to Tibet Talks. I'm Ashwin Verghese of the International Campaign for Tibet. We finally come to the end of our four-part special series on the four principal commitments of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And so far, what an incredible journey it's been. Let's take a look back now at some of the highlights from the first three episodes of this series.
Number one commitment, promotion of human value.
Humans are really born to be kind. People are fundamentally altruistic. These are part of our basic nature. Of course, we can learn to be selfish, we can learn to hate, but that's not our natural tendency.
One of my commitment is try to promote genuine harmony among different religious traditions.
All of the students got up, and of course all of them bowed down because they knew exactly what to do. So I also bowed down. And His Holiness, I think, knew who I was because he walked up and he straightened me up and he said, "You're a Muslim. You're not allowed to bow down before a human being. I'm a human being, so you should not bow down." You cannot imagine the impact that it had on someone like me.
The culture, Buddhist culture, I feel, as a result of seeing many trouble in this planet, Tibetan Buddhist culture really create peaceful society.
On that aspect, as you know, His Holiness has personally played a very strong role because he took on himself to meet with famous scientists and physicists and psychologists, and in his effort not only to learn from them but to find validation for Buddhist practices. Overall, it has given the Tibetan people also a new respect as well as validation for our cultural traditions.
I hope you've enjoyed learning more about His Holiness's four principal commitments. And I thank you for joining us for today's episode, where we'll be taking a look at his final commitment, a commitment to the revival of India's civilizational heritage. The Dalai Lama has called India his exile home ever since the Chinese government forced him into exile from his native Tibet in 1959. But in another sense, Tibetan Buddhists have always viewed India as a spiritual home because their religion derives from the Indian subcontinent. As a self-described son of India, the Dalai Lama is committed to reviving awareness of the value of ancient Indian knowledge. He believes the ancient Indian understanding of the mind and emotions, as well as techniques of mental training like meditation, are of great relevance today. In fact, India, he believes, is uniquely placed in the world today to combine ancient and modern ways of knowing. Let's hear now the words of His Holiness himself.
Now, hygiene of emotion in modern education, nothing. So, hygiene of emotion come only Indian tradition, based on karuna and ahimsa, as I mentioned earlier. You see, these, should combine as the hygiene of physical and the hygiene of emotion. So, now that's my fourth commitment, try to revive this ancient Indian knowledge, which we kept over 1,000 years in Tibet. Now this Indian can combine easily modern education and then ancient Indian knowledge combined.
To discuss the Dalai Lama's fourth commitment, we have a fantastic fourth and final guest for this episode of Tibet Talks, Mr. Rajiv Mehrotra. If you've lived in India any time over the past few decades, chances are you need no introduction to Rajiv Mehrotra, because he is a pioneering Indian television anchor and reporter who hosted various programs on India's public service TV channel from the early 1970s into the 2000s. But Rajiv Ji is also a longtime student of His Holiness the Dalai Lama for over 40 years, and today he serves as secretary and trustee of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which was founded with seed money from the Dalai Lama's 1989 Nobel Peace Prize. Rajiv is the perfect guest to discuss His Holiness's commitment to the revival of India's civilizational heritage and its value to today. And recently, he spoke with our ICT president, Tensho Gatso. Without any further ado, let's take a listen to that conversation now.
Rajiv Ji, thank you so much for joining us for this Tibet Talks program with the National Campaign for Tibet. In this series, we're focusing on His Holiness's fourth commitment, four principal commitments. Given that we just celebrated his 88th birthday, we thought of revisiting with some special guest speakers, and you are invited you to speak about ancient Indian wisdom, and thank you for finding the time and spending the time to join us. So just our audience is ICT members usually around the world. Not many of them have traveled to India and have not so quite, they see it from afar, but to have a more personal understanding of it, we thought would be really helpful. And so to begin, I wanted to ask if you would just define what ancient Indian wisdom, or what His Holiness means, and how is it relevant today as you see it?
Well, His Holiness, when he talks about ancient Indian wisdom, I think the two elements that he's really looking at are ahimsa, non-violence, and karuna, compassion, and of course mental hygiene. I mean, these are sort of the umbrella terms. And as far as ahimsa is concerned, non-violence, I remember I had the privilege of being with him in Oslo when he got the Nobel Peace Prize, and he dedicated that prize to Mahatma Gandhi. And I think that non-violence is a fairly familiar concept. But I think that this difference for His Holiness and Gandhi in some ways has been that for His Holiness, it is the motivation behind what you do. So if your motivation is non-violent, then, that embodies that. And for Gandhi, it was the means were as important as the ends. But His Holiness has written and spoken very eloquently about non-violence and ahimsa. And the second aspect, of course, was karuna, compassion. And as we know that compassion is who His Holiness is, the embodiment of the Buddha aspect of compassion, Avalokiteshvara. And it is what, in a sense, defines His Holiness and is at the core of his teachings and aspiration. And, really saying that if you can be truly compassionate, then the self that suffers softens. And so the cornerstone of his teaching is compassion. And that, connects with the mental hygiene. What does he mean when he uses the word mental hygiene? And he also often uses the idea of mental diet. So what he's really drawing on is the rich Indian heritage of training the mind. And so His Holiness argues that, we spend so much time training our minds to be productive, to get jobs, to look beautiful, or whatever else it may be. but we spend very little time on training our minds to be compassionate and happy, which really is the aspiration of all human beings, to be happy and to avoid suffering. But the way this connects to the Nalanda tradition, of which he is the inheritor, is the juxtaposition of method with wisdom. And that is an extremely important principle in His Holiness's teachings. And certainly when he goes into the more complex aspects of the Dharma and Buddhism, because His Holiness would argue that we can be familiar and listen to him and be inspired and moved, but until we adopt the methods of internalizing compassion, so that it is so embedded and it has very deep imprints in our consciousness that it affects our reflexive responses. So the genius of the civilizational heritage of India has been this juxtaposition and the methods by which you can train your minds and cultivate them beyond the purely intellectual engagement with it. And the correlative in some ways is that the sutra is the wisdom, and tantra is the method of achieving this. And it goes in and out in many layers as far as His Holiness embodies and the values that we're looking at. And so when he talks about the Nalanda tradition, he's not really looking at it purely in the context of its Buddhist identity or association. I mean, of course, it was a Buddhist university and there were these 17 Nalanda masters and what have you, but it was the techniques that were available in Nalanda tradition. And the cornerstone of that was the debate, which is a very important aspect of the Tibetan Buddhist practice today. But this wasn't debating in the manner that we understand it in Western terms, where two people take 2 points of view and argue them, and one is declared the winner. But debating was a technique to nurture intellectual clarity and alacrity. So debaters would take positions which they would rapidly change in terms of their arguments or interactions with each other. And so this trained them, and a very important principle that is so important today is to be able to see other points of view and to be able to sort of move rapidly between them. And so that would breed a respect for the otherness of the other point of view, which is really, really crucial in our times of so much fragmentation and division, where we are really unable to see the other point of view. And this also was that when the Buddhist scholars or the non-Buddhist scholars made the presentations of their philosophies, it wasn't just proclaimed. The points of view were articulated and had to be defended by other points of view of people from different traditions, both within Buddhism and beyond Buddhism. And so the other sort of peg on which His Holiness's teachings stand, drawing from the Buddha, was that it had to stand up to the scrutiny of reason, logic, and experience. So not just people from your own faith or own practices or belief systems, but those of others. So I think that these are the very deeply important principles, for our time in the modern world. And so His Holiness is built on this, and in fact embodies these ideals and principles in his own life and his own practice. And so it is all the aspects of the Nalanda tradition which include embracing science or embracing scientific knowledge, not in the manner of either sort of looking for validation, as we often do here today, that we had this glorious past and we had already discovered this. But the emphasis in Buddhism to understand the true nature of reality. And for that, we have to be open and responsive to all forms of knowledge, and including the empirical one that science offers, But most importantly, in the case of the method that His Holiness is talking about, is the non-conceptual experience of reality, which means that something that words cannot describe. There's a very simple analogy to this, that if I wanted to tell you, what coffee tastes like, I couldn't explain it to you until you tasted coffee. And this was really the Buddha's predicament when he attained enlightenment and he stepped out. He said, now, how do I teach this? So he outlined it as best he could verbally, but he provided the method for its realization. And that, I believe, is the seminal contribution of His Holiness, apart, of course, from his commitment to nonviolence, which is the cornerstone of his philosophy, of the way he lives his life, of the freedom movement of Tibet. But in terms of India's heritage, it is this aspect that I, as a student of the Dalai Lama, I truly celebrate.
Yes, His Holiness, I remember so many times says that the Chela, he calls himself the student of India, and India as the teacher, and that now it is the student's job to bring back the teachings to the teacher. And so, in this way, His Holiness is, I think, one of the most biggest spokesperson for India, because wherever he goes, he talks about the importance of the Nalanda tradition, the teachings that he received from India, that he is spreading wherever he goes, also putting it in not in a religious format, but in a way that is so simple for just any ordinary person to receive and get it. And he has, reached such a wide listenership around the world. So, Rajiv ji, can you tell us what is his impact in India itself, and how is he perceived in India?
Well, again, as a chela of His Holiness, I always respond to that comment and really say, well, now the chela has become the guru, and the guru has become the chela. So he really is the quintessential teacher of our times. And what makes him so remarkable is that he is not merely a protagonist of the Nalanda tradition, but really of the entire canvas of India's very diverse civilizational heritage, not just the ancient one, but his ability to go and willingness to go and perform the namaz at a mosque, or sing a hymn. Yes, in fact, it just recently happened, even as we speak, and so that shows a deep celebration of diversity and an expression of this, what I briefly mentioned, the mental diet that he talks about. And so what he's really saying is that the genius of India is our ability to create the context for people to have the mental diets that they need. And just as we need different physical diets, depending on the climate, our constitution, our predisposition, we need different mental diets. And I think that His Holiness is pretty much today celebrated as the preeminent spiritual master, if to put it in that manner, and who epitomizes the highest aspiration of our heritage. This is the human being who demonstrates to us that this journey, this achievement is possible and achievable, because here he is and he embodies it. So it's not something subject to the most rigorous scrutiny, and the many elements of his of who he is, and this goes right from his. I really don't know where to begin. In the sense that here is a man who still practices, or till very recently was practicing several hours a day of his own practice. So it isn't that he's the Dalai Lama, the incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, so he doesn't need to practice. And the sharing of that journey, whether it is in the film Kundan or his autobiography, of his journey of learning and growing and his continuing evolution towards Buddhahood. And so he hasn't allowed himself to get the stamp of having arrived. I mean, we believe he has, but he doesn't allow that to happen to him. And the fact that he would be willing to receive initiation and teachings, oral traditions from even monks younger than themselves. And so he is celebrated in India, and I'd say much of South Asia, and certainly in Nepal, where for political reasons he's not able to visit, or Sri Lanka. But certainly, I mean, I have read articles on extolling him in the Pakistani press in Bangladesh. And so while it may not be as public and broad-based as it is in India, and this sort of adulation ranges from, the beggar on the street, to whom His Holiness will lower his car window and greet, to, the most important political figures who sometimes, as happens in the rest of the world, will meet him quietly. But I think that across the political and cultural landscape, that here is a man who is celebrated, and I cannot think of any other figure resident in India or in the world, and I just don't say this because I am biased, and I know I am, but it is quite an amazing achievement, and not to mention the fact that the achievements of the Tibetan refugee community. It is one of the great success stories in human history that a refugee community has been exiled in another country, who have retained their identities and remained welcomed by their hosts. And that really has to do with His Holiness's own persona and personality and the direction that he has given to this. And it's legion, and I don't want to dwell on the fact that the way that his empathetic connection with people, which is a more universal phenomenon, is not just exclusive to India, where people feel this great catharsis from his deep integrity and how they feel touched. So he is deeply welcome and sought after, and I think there is great anguish and disappointment that as he ages, that he is not traveling as much as he did, but he is really the first choice for anyone who's organizing any kind of event, meeting, or seeking a blessing, even though they may come from other faiths and communities. So he is the embodiment of our civilizational heritage. And it is really moving for us in India that he has now become its greatest proponent and defender, in a sense, as it risks getting diluted. There's something I do want to sort of add to this as a way of celebrating the Guru, His Holiness's contribution, and of the Tibetans in this, and the fact that when Buddhism traveled to Tibet from India, unlike other traditions, it didn't travel because of through scriptures and writings. It traveled through practitioners of Buddhism, and when they reached Tibet, so it was both the conceptual framework, the articulated teachings of the Buddha, but the method aspect of it, so that the Tibetans preserved this heritage both experientially and in terms of the knowledge. And the Tibetan language expanded and came up with a new vocabulary to capture those the nuances of those teachings, which couldn't happen in India because Sanskrit was a frozen language. And so when the Tibetans came to India, like the Tibetan Institute of Higher Studies in Sarnath, or this Bodh Gaya Institute for the Preservation of India's heritage that is named after His Holiness. So they are really bringing back to India that heritage, and it's not just Buddhist. Buddhism was one of the peaks in the peaks and troughs of Indian history. Buddhism was one of those peaks. It wasn't isolated from the rest of the heritage. And So it is not just about Buddhism. It is about this aspect of our heritage that is living and not just scriptures, that is Holiness manifest. And I think people see that intellectually and intuitively, and so respond to him in a very special manner.
Mm. Yep. Thank you, Rajivji. And I think His Holiness's own bond with India is very, very special. And for all of us Tibetans also, being India, finding India as a refuge and home. I was also born here and brought up here, and I think also the Indian masters who did come to Tibet to bring Buddhism, who brought Buddhism to Tibet, it was to their credit that they said, you have a language and you should study in your own language, and then began this translation process of all the scriptures into Buddhism. I think we would do in the 7th, 8th century, probably Tibet has the largest number of translators anywhere, and that is what we have today. But now we see, when we talk about Tibetan Buddhism, we're also seeing a lot of Chinese influence, Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism, undermining it strategically. They are acting deliberately with the intent of undermining Buddhism and Tibetans. So, Rajivji, do you think India recognizes this, and is there a role that India could be playing in this?
Well, I think India is playing and has been playing. Both India didn't just welcome His Holiness as a refugee and kept the Tibetans as refugees. India was very proactive, even in the educational system that the schools that they set up for the Tibetans. They were encouraged to include Tibetan religion, culture, and language as a subject. So every Tibetan child was exposed to it. And for every significant Tibetan monastery that was destroyed in Tibet, another Tibetan monastery came up in India to preserve those. So in the sense that India has played an extremely active role in the preservation of that culture and heritage. And I think the only thing that may sort of undermine that some ways is, I think, the shifting relationship and of the Tibetan community itself, that the Tibetan population in India is shrinking. It is shrunk by 2/3. So there are fewer Tibetans in India, in the schools and in the monasteries. Some of that is being, in a sense, facilitating. So there are more Indians of Indian origin who are entering the monasteries, and the schools are now admitting Indian students. But I think the authenticity of the Tibetan experience and the practice is being diluted from somewhat within the community. Of course, the entire, where His Holiness is, as we speak, in Ladakh, and which is really, the border with Tibet for people who don't know, there is, deep passion for His Holiness and for the continuation of the Tibetan civilizational heritage. And so I don't think there is any doubt in any mind of any Indian of its value and the need for it to be preserved. And I think, the government of India has, made, I think, many substantial ways done their bit. And I think what the Chinese are trying to do is not just sort of capture the agendas of Tibetan Buddhism, but of Buddhism in general. And so there is a major initiative in other countries to be able to invite scholars and spend a lot of money. And I remember that, going to Sri Lanka, and some of the monks were telling us that the Chinese were trying to corrupt the Sri Lankan monks by offering them washing machines on each floor and central air conditioning.
Mhm.
So from the sacred to the profane, they have been using mechanisms to do this. And I think a critical moment will come when the issue of the succession of His Holiness comes up. And, hopefully, as His Holiness has promised us, he's going to be around for at least another, whatever, 20 plus years, that it won't happen in a hurry. But when it does, because so much of that agenda rests his shoulders. And I think that India will be a very welcoming space for the next Dalai Lama, as it will be Buddhism. But I think that this is an effort that Tibetans will also have to make, maintain its integrity and authenticity. And His Holiness has spoken about the ability and his openness for the continuing evolution of Tibetan Buddhism as it travels to the West. So he isn't stuck in orthodoxy in its practice, preservation, and promotion. And India would perhaps offer the most fertile ground to locate, for as long as is possible, the ancient tradition as it was practiced. But I don't think Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism is going anywhere. It may change some of its forms, but certainly it has a vitality and relevance that will endure far beyond our generation and our lifetimes, and dare I say, even artificial intelligence.
No, Rajivji, you have, and then I also, even in my lifetime or I look at the Himalayan regions all across. As you mentioned, His Holiness is right now in Ladakh, and I think it was His Holiness's clear vision right from the early days. As soon as he was able to travel, he really traveled a lot to the Himalayan regions wherever he could. And I think Buddhism, the practice of Tibetan Buddhism there now, is so alive and strong. And, debates and studies are not just in the monastic communities, but also within, society, and young people and lay people really actively studying and learning Buddhism. So I feel very encouraged by that. And even as we mentioned, the monasteries and schools, because of China's blockage of Tibetans crossing over the borders, the numbers have diminished. But at the same time, see a lot more from the Himalayan communities kind of going back to their Tibetan cultural roots and joining the schools and monastic communities. And then I think this is a strength for India to have the Himalayan communities, because they are of, culturally Tibetan, to have them, have that as a stronghold. It makes them stronger, and also it makes India stronger and richer, I feel. And I think that's what.
It's not just strategic in the terms of, because they're on the border. I think that the osmosis in there is very deep, and it's very profound. I mentioned that it is now people from within India who are participating in these. So even it's not just in the Himalayas; it's even in the monasteries in the south and the schools in Dharamsala. That it is the Indian community is beginning to come into it from Ladakh and from Himachal and what have you. So this cross-fertilization is in some ways going to enrich this and make it more contemporary and alive, beyond just the Tibetan, and it'll become a more universal, perhaps an Indo-Tibetan variety.
Very much so. And on that note, Rajivji, if I may ask, you have been a student of His Holiness for over 40 years. Can you share with us how you first met His Holiness and his impact on your life and work? And
Well, that I feel a little embarrassed, I must tell you, because I feel that the blessing of my relationship with His Holiness is he's a man of deep and great compassion, and I am a most unworthy student. And so I feel almost sort of uncomfortable talking about something that's deeply sacred to me. He has blessed me with, a number of abhishekams of a relationship of samaya. And so, the impact is truly deep and transforming. And it is it is living in every moment of my life. And the reason I don't talk about it too much is because I feel that so much is imperfect in terms of what he is, and as a student, who and what I should be. And he took me with him to the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony in Oslo, and then I was privileged to serve in setting up the foundation.
Yes, he entrusted you with that.
And I have continued for that time to volunteer my time to serve him, and not always, like I said, as well as I would have liked. So he is, in fact, he's sort of like a deity for me in my practice. And so I try in that to try and learn and to imbibe the many qualities and values that I learned from him. And it sounds a little rhetorical and cliched, to talk about his deep compassion, to talk about his deep humility, and then to claim that they have impacted me, because, I just feel the lack of those, rather than that I have those. But he has been in some ways a sort of both a very generous and gentle teacher, but also a harsh teacher. And I'll tell you, not in terms of as being angry, but I remember when my mother was dying, and I was not, many years ago, and I went to see His Holiness, and I was weeping, and he's given me the space to be, weep with him. So what I had hoped he would say was that he would say that, oh, don't worry, your mother will be all right. And I'm not a very advanced practitioner. And he said, well, meditate on death. And at that time, I thought that was a very harsh thing for him to say, instead of being nurturing and reassuring. And I learned over time that that was really the core of his teaching. And I remember another, incident. I was in Toronto, and there was this big event where there was, Karen Armstrong and Ken Robinson, who was an educationist. And someone asked him a complicated, difficult question. And I think the question was that, how do you think the human species will evolve in terms over several millennia? And he was silent for a long time. And there was this great expectation that after the silence, and, as he was contemplating, that there would be some terrific words of wisdom. And he just said, I don't know. And it was so transforming to hear that. So the obligation,
For them to know everything.
and the obligation that we feel to have an answer to every question. And I say this because I don't really have an articulated answer to your question. It is, who I am. And certainly if there are any positive qualities, they derive from him. And all the negative ones, I am guilty. And so, and I, how did I meet him? That was quite magical. I was studying at Oxford, and I came back, and it was the 70s, and I was really messed up. And so I just heard of His Holiness, and I wrote a letter to his office, and they wrote back, and yes, His Holiness will be happy to see you. And somehow it didn't work, and I got a scholarship. I went to America, and His Holiness was traveling. I think it was for the Kala Chakra in Tabo, but I'm not sure, in 81, 82. And he went to, there was a friend of mine who was the district commissioner in that area, and he was hosting His Holiness for lunch. And so His Holiness and the entourage walked in, and the first question he asked was, "Do you know Rajiv?" This guy was completely flummoxed. And he said, "Where did this come from?" And so he called me up and he said, "You know, the Dalai Lama is asking after you." And I don't know how he made that connection, that this was someone that who might know me. So I met him, and he wasn't as busy.
Were you already in TV media then? Were you? Is that how?
Yes,
Oh,
I was. And he then, I met him, and he was very, very generous with his time in those days. And I was lucky that he didn't have. I don't think he had many Indian students by then, and so it's been. And I'm sorry, I don't know.
It's step by step. I mean, His Holiness, as I think of his life also, everything that he's accomplished, it just slowly, it just happened like that, and I think, you're right in saying, right, I traveled to Dharamsala, and with me, many of our members and yes, have met with His Holiness. And every time we meet, I think, I remember one of my guests was saying, in that space, when you're with him, you're actually the best person you can be. You want to present your, it brings out all the goodness in you. So you have that very special feeling when you meet with him. So I think we're all very lucky and blessed.
And it really comes, as you're suggesting, and I think that, we're always looking to identify, again, this my sort of favorite idea of trying to conceptualize and verbalize what are the elements of His Holiness idea, personality, philosophy that are transforming. I just suggest it is who he is, period. And we can try and break it up, but we cannot break it up in words. And I think that is he transforms us not by what he says. And we sometimes want to grasp at words, and of course words are important. They can, be cataclysmic sometimes. But it is really the depth of his being. And that is, who he is. And so he has to be in some ways experience, rather than read or.
No, absolutely. No, Rajivji, you hit the nail there. Yes, it's not something that can be described.
Right.
It has to be felt. And no matter how much you prepare, it's completely different for different people.
And at different times.
Yes.
And each time it sort of resonates with your particular need or state of being at that time. So I may have a craving at some time, for His Holiness to be reassuring or to be give me a solution. And the last time I went moaning to him about the work of the foundation, and it is.
Can you tell us a little bit about the foundation and the work you do also, Rajiv?
Well, I'll just finish the story because I'm moaning that there's so much administrative work and all this is happening and there are files to be done, and these are challenging times for NGOs in India. And so he looked at me and he said, "You're my chela?" I said, "Of course, Your Holiness." He said, "Well, now you solve my problem. I'm not going to solve yours." So it's what I really needed to be told, not what I wanted to hear. And that is his genius. To be able to get it. Well, anyway, the foundation sort of represents His Holiness's a non-political and in some ways non-Buddhist, formal Buddhist agendas. So that's the idea of our work. So we have worked very extensively on nurturing interfaith dialogue, of building bridges between the Tibetan community and India. So we do a program where we take sort of 30 odd students for an immersion experience to Dharamsala. This has been going on for 27. This was our 27th year, and they have a audience with His Holiness. We've been looking at gender and faith, and because that is another area of His Holiness's interest.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the little shift, as is, Holiness doesn't have as much time for the foundation. So my personal passion as a student of his, and one of the key aspirations of the foundation today, maybe His Holiness wouldn't approve of it, but I feel it's needed, is to promote the idea of Dalai Lama studies. I think we need to begin to study the Dalai Lama, like we studied the Buddha, Christ, Karl Marx, and Gandhi, or what have you. And so we have 2 fellowship programs where we give fellowships for people who want to do independent research on the Dalai Lama and different aspects of his philosophy and his practice, and also on the Nalanda tradition. We are supporting at 3 universities in India Dalai Lama chairs, again with the idea to focus attention on this dimension. So one of our other breakthroughs is that we have a partnership with the University of Peace, Costa Rica, and to really try and now further His Holiness's agendas, but equally to deepen our understanding through academic research and study on the Dalai Lama himself. And so the range of activities we do devolve from this. I don't want to detail these and bore you, but this is the...
No, it's not boring at all.
I'm just saying, this is the essence of our aspiration and a little shift. And like I said, that if His Holiness may not be completely pleased that we wanted to study him, because,
As you're studying him, you're also studying the Nalanda tradition and what him did.
That's what I think. But we feel that this is the key now, because he embodies it. So
Yes.
what better way to internalize and learn this? And his political philosophy, how he's negotiation China and what have you, to break it up.
Yes, and his philosophy of nonviolence and peace and compassion and caring for the environment, all of that is just so relevant. He's a man who is much more, thinking much more advanced than anybody else, right from the beginning, from when he was a young man.
We don't even have, there is so much that, each time when I reflect, I think, oh, we missed out on his amazing work with social, emotional, and ethical learning. And, we have the Delhi government has adopted that program. So there are so many layers and layers of it. But I feel the essence is the man himself. And then from that, everything just flows.
Thank you, Rajiv.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Tibet Talks. And thank you for sticking with us throughout this special series on the Dalai Lama's 4 principal commitments. You can catch up on earlier episodes in video form at www.savetibet.org/live and as a podcast at www.savetibet.org/pod. That's also where you can check out future episodes of the show, and you can follow our podcast on Spotify, Apple, or Google Podcasts. You should also subscribe to ICT's YouTube channel so you don't miss any of our future episodes. I hope you've enjoyed learning more about the Dalai Lama's 4 principal commitments. At the International Campaign for Tibet, we are honored to serve the vision of His Holiness. Please join us in this work at www.savetibet.org/join. Thank you again for being with us on Tibet Talks. We'll be back next month with another episode. But until then, as we always say on the show, stay safe, stay well, and stay active. Tujache.